Why did the Beatles break up? Why does anyone break up? Infidelity, finances, personal differences, or sometimes we just drift apart. When I was younger, I was convinced it was Yoko Ono's doing. It was in articles, television. It became one of the first memes I ever saw about my favorite band.
She's awful. She's terrible.
She can't sing.
I love her.
But that never
I remember that. I think that was from Animaniacs, man. Okay, so we starting this one now on the backdrop of reacting to the other Beatles that Daniel Bildo did a buy me a coffee donation request too. So this is why did the Beatles break up? Want to give a shout out to James Mahara for this one. We're gonna be in for another long one, but it's a story behind it, and the fact that he opened up with Yoko Ono, I was thinking about that too, because when you have a woman talking to you, oh, you should say this, you should fight back, you should da-da-da-da-da-da. Yeah, who was Yoko Ono, by the way? Who was she? You know? So with that being said, we're gonna check this out. It's got another long one, so I'll help you guys out by taking my face out of the taking my face out for a little while. But with that being said, let's get it.
never sat right with me. How could one person upend years of professional friendship? Surely, this story has more nuance, emotional complexities, and creative difficulties than that. And it does. Breakups can be messy, and often they aren't sparked by just one thing. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr formed the most celebrated band in human history, but even that couldn't keep them together. You know how this story ends, but I'm going to show you why. Can you believe we only had the Beatles for 8 years after Ringo joined in 1962? And in those 8 years, they gave us over 200 songs like Hey Jude and A Day in the Life.
Now, I will say only 8 years. I will say that only 8 years were the entirety of the Beatles' existence. But yet we're still hearing about the Beatles 60 some odd years later. That's a cultural impact that far exceeds anything we may see today. So I just wanted to make that known.
And by their publicly announced breakup in 1970, the lads from Liverpool had changed the world of music forever. But to understand the beginning of the breakup, we have to go back, way back, to when they stopped touring. For any aspiring rock star, having thousands of fans screaming your name sounds like a fantasy, but the reality for the Beatles was utterly miserable. During the height of Beatlemania in 1966, the fans were screaming so loudly during live performances that Ringo had to look at the other members' shoulder movements in order to follow a song, because they were unable to actually hear themselves playing over the clamor, making the thing they loved, their music, sound subpar to them. Ringo says, "We used a house PA with those huge amps, and I had to watch the back of the boys because I couldn't hear nothing. And this is really my opinion, we really weren't playing great."
That's interesting. But if you look at the stage design of most shows that people were on, the crowd was very close to the stage. So it's easy to assume that the microphones at that time weren't cardioid or anything. They was picking up every sound that encompasses that stage. So yeah, I get it.
John Lennon and George Harrison were actually becoming fed up with touring. George most notably recalls a dangerous situation in August 20th, 1966, where the band was to perform at Crosley Field in Cincinnati, but had to call it off due to rain. George blames the venue for its poor planning. George says, "Cincinnati was an open-air venue, and they had a bandstand in the center of the ballpark with a canvas top on it. It was really bad weather, pouring with rain, and when Mal Evans got there to set up their equipment, he said, 'Where's the electricity power feed?' And the fella said, 'What do you mean electricity? I thought they played guitars.' He didn't even know we played electric guitars."
Wow, that's crazy.
It was so wet that we couldn't play. They brought in the electricity, but the stage was soaking and we would have been electrocuted. So
Right.
we canceled. The only gig we ever missed. But here's the rub. George, Ringo, and John were already getting fed up with touring, but not Paul. He still needed some convincing.
That's interesting because, I mean, you talking about what, 4 years of touring, if my memory serves me from the last video they did that nonstop. 4 years of touring. Bro, that's equivalent to doing 6-day weeks at work for 4 years. And you think people ain't gonna be tired? I mean, I love playing the music, man, but I need some rest.
We're already getting fed up with touring, but not Paul. He still needed some convincing. And as you'll see, this is an important piece of foreshadowing to their disbanding. Paul believed touring and playing live was integral to the band's success and growth, saying, "Touring's good, and it keeps us sharp. We need touring, and musicians need to play. Keep music live." But after canceling the rainy Cincinnati performance on August 20th, the band rescheduled for the next day, made the show, and then traveled 350 miles to St. Louis for another show that same day at 8:30 in the evening.
Wow.
And it was still raining. This harrowing trip sealed the deal for Paul to stop touring. He says, "It was worse than those..."
Bruh, it was a freaking sign for the heavens. That's why you stopped touring. The heavens said, hey, slow this party down. Y'all niggas is tired.
early days, and I don't even think the house was full. After the gig, I remember us getting in a big, empty, steel-lined wagon, like a removal van. There was no furniture in there, nothing. We're suddenly sliding around in the back of the van, and it was like, oh, fuck this. And finally, the guys, John and George, had been a little, murmur about touring. And finally, all of us were like, fuck this. So that was the moment. Instead of causing a big commotion with an official announcement, the band agreed to simply say nothing, finished their scheduled 1966 tour, and added no new dates until people realized they had no intention of getting back on the road. Now, this decision can be argued to be pretty great, seeing that they flourished in the recording studio. Without having to perform their songs live, they could take more chances musically, which is quite evident in albums like Sgt. Pepper's.
Yeah.
However, the decision to stop playing live comes only 4 years before their official breakup, and it seems Paul still had a soft spot for live performance, and John, George, and Ringo didn't have it as much. This small difference proved to be a part of the bigger picture in terms of breakup.
I get it. I think Paul might have been addicted to the praise. I can see him really being very rambunctious about, yo, we need to keep performing live. I would say, man, look, if we not going to tour, man, let's play live at least once a week, every Saturday, or once a month on a Saturday at a pub or something like that. I mean, it could have been a lot of different compromises in that, but if the rest of the band is tired, then the rest of the band is tired. But I do think after 4 years of touring, I think rest. They need rest, man. They need rest. And even if we go into the studio, we going over music, I think the guys may have wanted to do, there could have been song fatigue where we tired of performing these songs and we want to make some new music. You know, it could have been that too.
Hear this quote by John, and I think you'll see what I mean. John says, "I was thinking, well, this is the end, really. There's no more touring. That means there's going to be a blank space in the future. That's when I really started considering life without the Beatles. What would it be? And that's when the seed was planted that I had to somehow get out of the Beatles without being thrown out by the others. But I could never step out of the palace because it was too frightening." So in John Lennon's own words, the Beatles stopping touring played a pivotal role in him thinking about leaving. After they finished touring, the Beatles took a 3-month hiatus in August 1966. John went off to film a role in the anti-war comedy How I Won the War in Spain between September and October, and began to write the song Strawberry Fields Forever. And although it's credited to Lennon
Oh, shoot. Strawberry Fields?
in October, and began to write the song Strawberry Fields Forever. And although it's credited to Lennon McCartney, it was for argument's sake mostly written by John. Not the first time he had written a song without Paul, but their songwriting split was definitely happening at this point. John then meets Yoko at her art exhibit in early November that year, and they began to get to know each other while he was still with his wife, Cynthia. Later that
Wow.
November, the band gets to work on their first recording session since Revolver. At this point, since they stopped touring, and Brian Epstein informed EMI that they wouldn't be releasing any new music for the Christmas market, the press began to take the group's lack of activity as a sign that they were on the verge of splitting up. So when news broke that
That's wild, bro. That's some social media level intelligence by the media right there. Maybe the group tired, bro. How many times I'm gonna keep saying that the group is tired?
activity as a sign that they were on the verge of splitting up. So when news broke that they were back in the studio, it hit the front page. The Beatles were back as they began to create Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a novel concept album idea by Paul McCartney. Paul wanted distance from their original image. Paul says, "I thought, let's not be ourselves. Everything about the album will be imagined from the perspective of these people. So it doesn't have to be us. It doesn't have to be the kind of song you want to write. It could be the song they might want to write." John and George report.
That's an interesting concept. That's why all those people was appearing, because I know one head I remember seeing was Aleister Crowley, and I read about him, and it wasn't a lot of good things about Aleister Crowley.
Of song you want to write. It could be the song they might want to write. John and George reportedly had doubts about Paul's make-believe scenario, but neither had an alternative idea for showcasing the new music. So they went with Paul. This created a strange new dynamic in the band. Paul leading the way even had engineer Jeff Emmerich calling him the band's de facto producer, giving him an upper hand in the Beatles. Even Ringo started to notice a divide brewing. Ringo says, "Sgt. Pepper was our grandest endeavor. It gave everybody, including me, a lot of leeway to come up with ideas and to try different material. John and Paul would write songs at home usually, or wherever they were, and bring them in and say, 'I've got this.' The actual writing process was getting to be separate by now, but they'd come in with bits and help each other, and we'd all help. John, Paul, and George, the writers, were putting whatever they wanted on the tracks, and we were spending a long time in the studio. We were still recording the basic tracks as we always did, but it would take weeks to do the overdubs for the strings or whatever, and the percussion would be overdubbed later and later. Sgt. Pepper was great for me because it's a fine album, but I did learn to play chess while we were recording it. Chess is fun, but I imagine making music would have been more fun for poor Ringo. We saw where John first thought he might actually want to leave, but this quote here by George Harrison about the arduous process of recording Sgt. Pepper's, I believe shows where he began to consider the end of the band. George says, "I felt we were just in the studio to make the next record, and Paul was going on about this idea of some fictitious band. That side of it didn't really interest me, other than the title song and the album cover. It was becoming difficult for me because I really wasn't into it. Up to that time, we had recorded more like a band. We would learn the songs and then play them. Sgt. Pepper was the one album where things were done slightly differently. A lot of the time, it ended up just being Paul playing the piano and Ringo keeping the tempo, and we weren't allowed to play as a band so much. It became an assembly process."
Interesting. So symptoms of the breakup was already happening. Even the recording process was arduous and a little different than that. That's not a band. That's like somebody coming in and doing their parts for the movie and then saying cut and yeah, we good for the day. That's like if I got a couple lines in a song or a couple lines in a movie, and for this song, my recording process is done. So the arduous task, like these songs weren't being made quickly. I get it. Definitely does give me a little bit more context behind like what might have been happening behind the scenes, and the fact that Ringo was talking about we wasn't recording as a band just definitely does throw a little salt on that white meat.
And we weren't allowed to play as a band so much. It became an assembly process, just little parts and then overdubbing. And for me, it became a bit tiring and a bit boring. I had a few moments in there that I did enjoy, but generally, I didn't really like making that album much. After what had happened in 1966, everything else seemed like hard work. It was a job, like doing something I really didn't want to do. And I was losing interest in being fab at that point. Everybody else thought that Sgt. Pepper was a revolutionary record, but for me, it was just not as enjoyable as Rubber Soul or Revolver, purely because I had gone through so many trips on my own that I was growing out of that kind of thing. Despite the issues with making the album, Paul's idea turned into a massive success.
That's crazy. Yeah, so personal growth will help you grow out of what you're already used to, and you will want to do something different. So like for me, for instance, I still do it though, but I used to do a lot of lyrical miracle rap back when I first started rapping, because I was just rapping for the enjoyment of rapping and rhyming words and putting those together. But by the time I turned, I think 20, I wanted to do more stories. I wanted to do more conceptual. I wanted my words to matter. So I kind of feel Ringo on that.
Sgt. Pepper spent a whopping 27 weeks at number 1 on the UK charts and 15 weeks at number 1 in the US after its release in May 1967. So it was worth it, wasn't it? Well, it seems the damage had already been done. We have John and George already contemplating the end of the band, and Ringo is tired of playing chess. All the while, Paul is growing ever more confident in his abilities. But here's where the catalyst comes, a huge, shocking moment. Brian Epstein dies. In August 1967, their longtime manager and friend Brian Epstein was found dead in London after an unintentional drug overdose. John was at a loss. He says, "I knew that we were in trouble. I didn't really have any misconceptions about our ability to do anything other than play music, and I was scared. I thought, we fucking had it." The next year...
That's crazy. Now, he must have been the voice of reason in that band. He must have been sort of like the glue that locks everything together. And when he died, the band, it's almost like it's a free for all now. Like, what are we going to do?
February 1968, the Beatles go on a retreat to Rishikesh, India, to study transcendental meditation with the Maharishi. And John says, "Although I was meditating about 8 hours a day, I was writing the most miserable songs on earth." So when they returned to London, John decided to abandon Cynthia and begin a serious relationship with Yoko Ono, escaping the bore of his domestic life.
So that's true. That's true that the band began to do transcendental meditation. He met Yoko Ono. He had already met her. He left his wife. Oh, John, the karma.
So when they returned to London, John decided to abandon Cynthia and begin a serious relationship with Yoko Ono, escaping the bore of his domestic life. This is where the part everyone knows comes in. John starts bringing Yoko to the recording studio. Now, before I continue, after seeing everything in this video leading up to her involvement, doesn't it already seem like some members want out? John saying the seed had already been planted after stopping touring, and George saying that he was tired of being Fab. However, her presence didn't really help.
Right. Of course it wouldn't.
Beatles rarely allowed
the recording
guests
studio
into the
is a sacred space.
And if anyone outside of them were to give input, at best it would be George Martin or Jeff Emerick. But John decided to bring Yoko in as a collaborator in 1968 while they began working on the White Album. Yoko would sit on the studio floor talking to John in a low voice and basically shadow to him everywhere he went. Then the unthinkable. While they were working on a song, Yoko gave John advice on a vocal. The room fell silent. Paul says, "Fuck me. Did somebody speak? Who the fuck was that? Did you say something, George? Your lips didn't move." We are getting into it now. But here's the thing. John wanted her there. He asked her to be there. Yoko says, "He wanted me to be part of the group. He created the group, so he thought the others should accept that. I didn't particularly want to be part of them." So whose fault is that? Yoko's? John wanted her there. But it doesn't help also that John and Yoko were both now doing heroin. John and Paul barely composed together. George was coming into his own, even to the point that he brought Eric Clapton in to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Jeff Emerick quits working with the Beatles because of their nasty behavior. Even Ringo wanted to quit now, saying, "I had definitely left. I couldn't take it anymore. There was no magic and the relationships were terrible. I knew we were all in a messed up stage. It wasn't just me. The whole thing was going down. down. Ringo went to John's apartment and told him, "I'm leaving the group because I'm not playing well and I feel unloved and out of it, and you three are really close." John replied that he felt the same way. Ringo went off on holiday, and even though the end was near, the boys sent him a telegram saying, "You're the best rock and roll drummer in the world. Come on home. We love you." They were still like brothers, weren't they? Despite it all.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't last. This is where it gets really messy.
See, this that stuff I was talking about in the last video, that all these people who had nothing to do with making music was coming in. So now opinions, and then John Lennon seemed to be spiraling. He's now, what he's doing to Paul is kind of coming full circle for me. And it does look very vindictive on John's end with what he was doing, maybe under Yoko Ono's influence, but I don't know if I should be saying her whole name. That lady looks scary, bro.
In 1968, the Beatles launched their new record label, Apple, and after a slew of issues with Yoko, where George Harrison had become fed up with her equal input, got into a fight with John, some say it turned physical, George walks out saying, "I'm out of here, put an ad in the papers and get a few people in, see you around the clubs." John chose to be a jerk and started to play The Who's A Quick One while he's away to mock George, and even suggested replacing him with Eric Clapton. They reconciled with George under new terms, and while filming the end of Let It Be, they played their last live concert on that infamous rooftop. They smiled, they played. It was one of the best live performances in music history, hands down. But it was all about to end. Apple was bleeding money to the point when an accountant quit, he left a memo saying, "Your personal finances are in a mess." The Beatles realized they needed a new manager as they were not adept at finances. Paul decided that his wife, Linda Eastman's father, and her brother would be perfect for the job.
Oh, that's how they came in.
Specialized in artist representation. But the rest of the band was like, hell no, thinking it would be a terrible idea to have Paul's in-laws overseeing their business. I mean, there is a saying, never mix money and family. Enter the accountant, Alan Klein.
Okay, so this is how he come in.
The hand of, and Mick Jagger, who Klein managed for a time, wrote a note to Paul about him saying, "Don't go near him." Klein wanted in on the Beatles for a while, and now he had his chance. 2 days before the rooftop.
Ooh, man, this just seems like a string of bad decisions. Like, even using my foresight, I can see it. Now I got a little bit more detail about John Lennon's thing going on with Yoko and him using drugs. And John Lennon seemed like he was on a downward spiral anyway. But it just meaning Yoko just kind of put an asterisk on his life right there. And then the personal finance thing is fine. I think it would have been better if the group itself, the group dynamic itself wasn't so fractured already. Like, had they bought them in earlier before the group, the in-law, had they brought the in-laws in before the group started being fractured, I think the group would have been more open to it. But now, since nobody trusts each other, there's like, oh yeah, we don't trust Paul either. So
Klein met John and Yoko, charming them with his knowledge of the Beatles catalog, and won them over. Klein was a brutish businessman. When Paul had brought Linda's father and brother to a meeting with Alan Klein, Klein turned it into a shouting fest until Paul and his in-laws left the meeting. Despite this, John convinced George and Ringo.
John Lennon's starting to look like Yoko.
Man for the job. George saying, "We favored people who were street people." But there was no time left to debate. The Beatles lost the right to Northern songs because they couldn't take over Brian Epstein's former management firm after he died. Paul eventually couldn't fight the rest of the band anymore and agreed to have Klein manage them, but refused to put his signature on Klein's contracts. Paul not signing actually ended up being a very good move, but we'll get back to that. The Beatles released Abbey Road in September 1969, while still playing more and more apart, and John and Yoko had performed live with another group that included Eric Clapton. This must have emboldened him with the confidence to do what he did next. During a meeting with Klein, soon after that performance, Paul says they should go back to performing live. Remember how Paul said 3 years earlier, touring's good and it keeps us sharp. We need touring and musicians need to play, keep music alive. Well, this is what John had to say to him. I think you're daft. I wasn't going to tell you, but I'm breaking the group up. It feels good. It feels like a divorce. The room once again fell silent.
Dude. John Lennon was on Demon Time. John Lennon was on Demon Time, bro. John Lennon was like, yo, he was on full war mode. Like, yo, I've been wanting to leave, dog. You know what I'm saying? I'm gonna go ahead, take my money, take my honey, and I'm gonna get out of here and get lucky. You know what I'm saying? Like, he was completely disgusted with the group. Like, and I bet Klein's influence has something to do with that. Like, my opinion on, I thought John Lennon was a soft boy. Okay.
Paul said everyone's jaws dropped. After the meeting where Klein convinced John not to go public with his leaving for marketing reasons, John and Yoko went into their car. Yoko recalls saying, "We went off into the car, and he turned to me and said, 'That's it with the Beatles. From now on, it's just you. Okay?' I thought, my God, those 3 guys were the ones entertaining him for so long. Now I have to be the one to take the load." You know, the more and more I say all of this, the more and more I feel like Yoko got thrown under the bus. I mean, what do you think? Because obviously...
I ain't gonna lie, I was kind of throwing her under the bus too, but she seemed very shy. Like, the way they present her in these videos that we've been watching, I thought it may have been Yoko influencing John, but it seemed like Yoko wasn't doing much.
Her presence in the recording studio was annoying, but there was a lot more going on to consider. However, this destroyed Paul. He said, "John's in love with Yoko, and he's no longer in love with the 3 of us." Paul began to drink all day, stopped writing music. He was depressed until his wonderful wife Linda spoke to him, saying, "You don't have to take this crap. You're a grown man." With her encouragement, Paul began to work on his first album as a solo artist. He called John in March 1970 and told him he was leaving the Beatles. However, Let It Be was about to be released, and Klein and the rest of the band didn't want Paul to release his debut album in April, as he initially planned, to allow room for the Beatles album. They sent Ringo to explain this to Paul, and after a huge argument, Paul kicked Ringo out of his house. Ringo felt terrible and convinced John and George to let Paul keep his original release date. But Paul did something no one expected. He publicly announced he was leaving the Beatles with a self-interview accompanying his debut album. John was pissed, saying, "I wanted to do it. I should have done it. I was a fool not to do it, not to do what Paul did, which was use it to sell a record. I started the band. I disbanded it. It's as simple as that." Paul responded, "I think it's just straightforward jealousy. Ringo left first, then George, then John. I was the last to leave. It wasn't me." That wasn't it for Paul. He was a man on a mission. Not only...
But it almost like, when you see a lead singer of a group, you almost think he's the leader of the group. So if he says he's leaving, that makes it look like that takes everything away from John. Yeah, Paul's a little bit on Demon Time too.
Did he use the breakup to boost sales of his solo album?
That's probably true.
Sights on Alan Klein.
Yeah.
Paul wanted to be done with Apple. He didn't want to have anything to do with Alan Klein. Paul calls George to say he wants off the label, to which George replies, "You stay on the fucking label. Hare Krishna." He reached out to John, but to no avail. Paul threatened to sue, and Alan Klein laughed at him. But they couldn't stop Paul. Paul sued. Paul won. It also helped that Paul never signed Alan Klein's documents. Later, the rest of the band would actually sue Alan too, admitting that Paul was probably onto something. And Klein actually ended up going to jail for fraud. A real piece of work, wasn't he? All 4 Beatles would never play again together, but each created a successful career for themselves. In the end, after all the dust settled, they only seemed to have love for one another. They mourned for one another. They would always still be the Beatles. Breakups rarely have just one cause, but in this case, there were 4. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I actually learned a ton making this, and it even inspired me to make a breakup song. I call this one, You Should Leave This Unread. See you next time.
All right, that's it. I won't review his song, but you guys can go to his channel and listen to the song itself. Wow, that was a lot. That was a lot, man. It definitely filled in the gaps of the last video we watched. So shout out to Daniel Bildo with the Buy Me a Coffee donation request. I would love to do more documentary type reactions to various bands and getting to learn the history of the bands and stuff like that. I'm into that. I'm definitely into that. And but I think this would be a staple on the channel that could prove to be real good. I think if everybody receives it correctly. But at the same time, man, like I love history. So reacting to the Beatles would further enhance this information, will further enhance my future Beatle reactions. So with that being said, post your comments down below. Let me know what you guys think about this. Like if you ain't know this, what do you guys think about, Yoko Ono taking the brunt of the blame? You know what I'm saying? Like, let me know what y'all feel in the comment section. And there any other bands you guys want me to learn the history of? All right. Peace.